Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, so I got a lot I want to try and go through today, so let's just get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network. And we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the information flowing. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the lectures, the discussions, the topics, the revelations, the hosts and guests on the other shows of the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the libertyworksradionetwork.com if you're not already there listening online, and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $15, $20 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need the support of the listening audience to keep the network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on my favorite topic on this show every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock, which of course is the maladministration of the federal personal income tax by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower federal courts, which have been enforced and administered unconstitutionally for the last 75 years. You want to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start getting educated, because I've got all the information published there that exposes the extent of the fraud being perpetrated on the American people in the name of tax only, under color of law and color of office, both by the IRS and the federal judges, who have no authority to enforce a direct non-apportioned tax on the income of all persons in the 50 states. That's constitutional fraud. It's nonsense. It has been for 75 years. It's all exposed at taxfreedom.com. This should be what's going viral in the country. The fact that the IRS, the DOJ, and the courts have been a complete and total fraud for 50 years, with the judges actually conducting an insurrectionist rebellion within the judiciary. Rebellion against the Constitution, against limited government, against the rule of law, and against the American people and their freedom and prosperity, in order to fund an ever expanding, ever more powerful bureaucratic state that is free to do, or has been free to do, whatever it wanted under the regulatory deference provided by the Chevron doctrine, which has been repealed, and the ability to reach into your paycheck and steal as much of it as they want to fund their unconstitutional agendas, rather than to focus on helping the American people and making the American people productive and secure, or as Trump puts it, make America great again. So you've been betrayed by the federal judges. They have thrown away the Constitution. They've been enforcing nothing but the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which is a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. That's where you find graduated taxation of revenue, the earnings of all persons. It's communism. Straight up the second plank. Rob the people, set them against each other with class legislation that divides them and has them fighting one another, rather than focusing on the robbery being committed by the political class, which is looting the treasury and running out the currency to the detriment of every single American alive and that will live in the next 100 years. So, we're going to talk about this a bit today, but if you want to get informed and educated, I've got it all written up at taxfreedom.com. And if you know anyone that needs help answering IRS correspondence or fighting the Department of Justice in court on federal tax charges, either civil or criminal, you should send them over to irszoom.com to get in touch with me through that website, because the Supreme Court has exposed all of this fraud that it itself has allowed to occur for 50 years, but which has actually been perpetrated by the judges of the circuit courts. as every single one of the circuits in the country gradually since 1980 adopted the line of argument position that says the income tax is an unlimited, non-apportioned, direct tax on all earnings on all persons in the 50 states. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's frivolous to argue anything else. And they've been lying to you. The Supreme Court ruled very clearly in Moore et al. v. United States last year in June that income taxes are indirect taxes. They're not direct at all. They're indirect under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. They're not direct under the 16th Amendment. That's been a constitutional fraud. And it has resulted in the destruction and the quality of life of the American people as the IRS comes to rule the American people. And everybody knows, there's something very, very, very wrong and un-American with the way the IRS operates today to enforce tax law. And this, at taxfreedom.com, explains it all to you exactly what it is that's wrong. And it starts with the federal government violating the Constitution to rule you rather than represent you by stealing your money under the guise and pretense of income taxation, when they have absolutely no federal authority whatsoever to tax your earnings or income or revenue or rent or interest or dividend or salaries or wages or compensation or alimony or tips or commissions. None of those sources are subject to indirect taxation by impost, duty, and excise under Article 1, which the Supreme Court says is what the income tax is, a function of indirect taxation of foreigners and foreign activity by impost, of exported goods by duty, and of commodities, licenses, and corporations by excise. And there is no other taxing power granted by the Constitution that reaches the American people with legal effect or force of law. It does not exist. Income isn't the object nor the subject of the federal taxation of income. Income is the yardstick. It's the mechanism by which the amount of tax owed is calculated. And the amount of tax owed is calculated based on the earnings derived from the impost, duty, or excise taxable activity or transactions you engaged in. If there is no impost, duty, or excise taxable activity, and no earnings are derived from those taxable activities, then there is no tax to measure by income. You don't just tax everything the citizen made, claiming it's a direct tax. You need an indirect authority, impost, foreign, duty, export, excise, commodity license, corporation. Without one of those bases, there is no federal taxing power that reaches the earnings or revenue or income of the American people living and working in the 50 states, where the federal government has no territorial jurisdiction to tax and no legislative jurisdiction to tax your right to work or other activities not associated with or subject to impost, duty, or excise taxation under Article 1, Section 8. The whole thing's been a great, big, huge constitutional fraud, and the Supreme Court has exposed it. And there's only one step left to take, and that is to apply the same rulings they made in Moore to a domestic tax case rather than the foreign case that the rulings came out of. Moore was about the repatriation of foreign earnings, specifically about earnings made in India under a tax treaty. But what they laid out in Moore laying out and reasserting all of the taxing powers granted by the Constitution together with the limitations still applicable to each form, i.e., all direct taxes must be apportioned to the states, the several states for payment, in proportion to the last census. The Supreme Court said those two limitations, proportionate apportionment of the tax to the several states according to the last census, that's still in place. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 still limit all direct taxes. It's never been repealed or amended, not even with conjunction with or in association with the application of the 16th Amendment. It did not have that effect. Supreme Court makes this very clear and more. All direct taxes must be apportioned to the several states. That means no court in the country has authority to enforce a direct income tax against a citizen. Every single enforcement action since 1960 has been a constitutional fraud, except where it was associated with foreign activity or alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. So that's where we're at. The income tax has been exposed as a fraud, and that means it has to go away. It has to go away. It has to end. A jury is going to end it when they have this explained to them, or the Supreme Court is going to end it at some point when they take a domestic tax case and apply these rulings. Everything the IRS has done for 60 years has been based on the fraudulent claim that it's a direct, unavoidable income tax without subjectivity to any constitutional limitation. You earn, you owe, no exceptions, no limitations. And that's been a constitutional fraud, an absolute constitutional fraud that has been perpetrated by every circuit court in the country against the American people. It's the judges, the federal judges, who have betrayed the American people and begun to enforce the Communist Manifesto upon them instead of legitimate federal taxation. Indirect taxation of foreign activity, foreign persons, and in foreign places by impost, of exported goods by duty, and of the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, licenses to pursue certain occupations, and the corporate privilege by excise, where it is the privilege that is the subject of the tax, not the mere earning of money. Without privilege or subjectivity to impost or duty, there is no taxable activity or transaction or event or in a place subject to indirect federal taxation by impost, duty, or excise. It simply doesn't exist. And the class legislation of Section 1 in the tax brackets is totally unconstitutional because it's not uniform with respect to the treatment of the citizens. And Congress has no authority to discriminate against citizens to write different tax law for the different classes they create. And the argument that geographical uniformity controls is nonsense, because geographical uniformity opens the door to Congress being allowed to discriminate on the basis of religion, national origin, gender, sexual preference, age. And it's perfectly okay as long as everyone is treated the same in each state within each class created. And that, of course, is nonsense. Congress has no authority whatsoever to discriminate against the American people, not on any of those bases, nor on the basis of wealth, property, earnings, revenue, or income. Americans have to be treated the same under the law. You can't break us into classes and write different laws, different rates of tax for different classes. That is patently unconstitutional class legislation. The Supreme Court wrote it all up in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust in 1896. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I think I hear the first commercial break coming up. We'll be back in 5 with more on more. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network, and let's just get right back into this. Okay, as I was saying, it's the judges who have been engaged in insurrectionist sedition against the American people to prop up this socialist system of basically the second and the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto. The second plank being a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, and the fifth plank being, in short, a Federal Reserve Bank. Monopoly on currency and credit in a quasi-private corporate government bank. So the fifth plank is the Federal Reserve Bank monopolizing currency and credit, and the second plank is the income tax. The fifth plank allows them to print currency without immediate apparent consequence, and the second plank allows them to steal from your paycheck the excess currency that they're printing, thus removing from your pocket your economic power and from your vote your political power. Because as long as they can steal as much of your paycheck as they want under the guise and pretense of taxation, they can fund whatever agenda they want, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the agenda they're funding is global government at American expense, on the backs of American labor, on American debt. And that's why you have $37 trillion in debt. They've been spending it all over the planet in pursuit of a global government instead of focusing their spending on an American government. And this is being done by the cabal of worldwide bankers that include the central banks of all the nations that have central banks, the Federal Reserve Bank, etc., who want to rule the world and get rid of the governments and the borders that interfere with their multinational corporations plundering the natural resources of the third world and selling products into the wealthy first world markets. So it's all about being ruled by the government's control of your money. And that's why the Founding Fathers put in the Constitution that no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a legal tender in payment of debt. And that brings into focus the unconstitutional power that has been given to the Federal Reserve Bank, because the power to create legal tender is a power prohibited to the states by Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, and which is not granted to the federal government. And therefore, it is a power under the 9th and 10th Amendments reserved to we, the American people, and no other party to exercise. And that means that Title 31, Section 5103, which declares Federal Reserve notes to be legal tender, that's unconstitutional. That's Congress declaring private notes to be legal tender. They have no authority to write that law. The power to declare legal tender is prohibited to the states and not granted to Congress to exercise in statute. The entire Federal Reserve Bank is an unconstitutional monopoly on currency and credit that has literally ruled this country since 1928, when the excess printing of money between 1913 and 1928, 15 years, caused a depression, destroyed the currency value, and caused a depression because the bankers stopped lending money. When the stock market fell and all the excess cash and collateral was consumed by the margin calls, and the bankers stopped lending money. They stopped providing capital for the American people to exist on. And what happened? Nobody had any money. Breadlines. Not because there wasn't any work, but because there was no cash to pay them, because the bankers were denying the capital it's absolutely necessary to have a medium of exchange in circulation sufficient for the population to conduct its daily activities. And when they stopped making loans of the printed capital and seized all of the gold coin. They removed all the currency from circulation, and when you take away all the medium of exchange, you immediately get a depression. No work, no payment, no food, no value. And it would have destroyed the country, except the bankers were convinced by Roosevelt to begin lending again, not to the American people, but to the government, so it could lend to the European governments under the Lend-Lease Act, so that those European governments could then immediately send all the money back to America as orders for goods to wage the war. So it's the Lend-Lease Act that pulled the American people out of the Depression. That's what put people back to work, is producing goods for the European war effort. But it's the Federal Reserve Bank that cut off the capital and caused the Depression. And it's an unconstitutional monopoly, and it needs to be removed. And for the last 75 years, the federal government pretty much ignored this perversion within our government, this sedition. And Donald Trump now is trying to address it. And the news, of course, is his efforts to fire one of the Federal Reserve Board members, Elisa Cook, who has been caught lying on mortgage applications, which, of course, is what the Federal Reserve Bank does. It puts up the money and interest rates for mortgages, as well as all the other lending. But this gal has been accused, just like Letitia James in New York, has been accused and caught lying on her mortgage application. So the Democrats, of course, were projecting when they accused Donald Trump of mortgage fraud. And of course, his accusation was based on subjective valuation. Everybody knows that when you look at the value of the property, if you look at the tax records, you get a much lower valuation than what you get if you look at retail sales, recent sales in the neighborhood for properties. So the valuation is incredibly subjective, depending upon whether you ask a real estate broker what property is worth, or if you go to the tax records and look at how much they collected tax on, especially with properties like what Trump has down there in Florida, because all the properties have to be taxed at the same rate. You can't tax the billionaire at a higher rate because he's got one fancy spread, and nobody else could afford to pay the higher rate without getting taxed off their property, which Florida doesn't want to do. So in these Florida areas, the tax records and property valuations are way, way, way below the retail valuations. So it's an entirely different kind of alleged fraud to accuse somebody of being wrong about the valuation as opposed to lying about where they physically live or what their primary residence is going to be and where it's going to be. So Trump has fired this woman, chairman of the board, which is pretty unusual because most of the time the government doesn't interfere with the board members. But Trump wants the board to react. He's been after Powell for months and is, of course, going to replace him. He's already talking about possible candidates to get rid of Powell because Powell's been late to the game with everything he's done. He let interest rates go way too high and was late in stopping the rise, and now he's incredibly late in lowering rates back down. Every other nation on the planet, Western industrialized, interest rates at 2.5% or less. Powell still got us up at 4.5%, with mortgage rates at 6 to 7, which is shutting down Main Street. They can't afford those mortgage rates, and they can't afford to borrow. So Trump is trying to make the Fed be more responsive to American conditions rather than feel like it has to sit in oversight and control everything that occurs, which has been the role it's been playing for, the last 50 years? And Trump is right to be attacking it. He's right to be replacing Powell, who's been bad for America. And he's probably right to be going after this girl, Lisa Cook, who has filed a lawsuit to try and prevent him from doing it. So we'll have to see how that plays out and see what the courts say. Because I think this is an area that you haven't seen much legislation, haven't been much legal contestation of these relationships, because the government's been loath to take the Fed into court, and the Fed's been loath to take the government into court for fear of what might come out of a courtroom confrontation. I mean, this woman, Lisa Cook, has sued Donald Trump. Somebody should file an amicus curiae brief pointing out the whole Federal Reserve Bank is unconstitutional. And that issue needs to be addressed before you get to anything else. So we'll see what the courts do. But, they've stayed away from court for 75 years because they opened the door to that kind of filing when they take it to court. So she's sued him to try and stop him from firing her. We'll have to see what comes out of it and what comes of it. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about for this last segment we got coming up is, as I said, the income tax has got to end. It's got to end. It's an unconstitutional system. It's communistic. It's not constitutional. It divides the American people. It doesn't unify them. It allows the government to use class legislation to keep them divided so that they fight amongst themselves and can be ruled by the political class rather than represented. And Trump, of course, is trying to restore representative government to the people rather than to impose upon them the rule of a worldwide global government that eliminates borders and lets the poor from poor nations flood the wealthy so that the wealthy can take care of the poor. And nobody will be wealthy anymore. Everybody will be poor, calling out for the government to control the poverty, which they created to assume power. So, the tax has got to go. It doesn't work. It doesn't fund the government. It doesn't uniformly treat the citizens. It doesn't raise enough money for the government to operate. It's arbitrary, vague, and capricious. It lets the corporate subjects intended to pay the tax off the hook entirely by fraudulently doing their accounting and never having profits. It shifts the burden of the entire tax system unconstitutionally onto the backs of labor. So the system's got to end. It's got to end. So what are our choices for something new? Well, there's a whole lot of stuff that's been thrown out there as possible choices, right? You have people talking about a flat tax. A flat tax. We're going to tax everybody the same number so it'll be easy. 10%, 15%, 20%, 33%. What's the flat rate going to be for the wealthy and the poor? You also have proposals for a sales tax or a VAT tax like Europe has. And we also have something called a fair tax that's been proposed. So in the next 15-minute segment here, we're going to look at what's wrong with all of these alternative proposals and examine a proposal that I believe is legitimate, constitutional, and is probably the only way to go if you're going to continue with any kind of revenue tax at all. So, we're going to do that in the next 15 minutes because people need to know all of these other alternative systems are completely unconstitutional. They're just as unconstitutional as the graduated income tax is. And I'm going to explain why in the next segment when we get back. And so, again, I want to encourage the listening audience to find their way over to libertyworksradionetwork.com. Get signed up as a subscribing member. Find your way over to taxfreedom.com and get educated. And tell anyone you know who needs help to head over to irszoom.com to get help in dealing with the IRS, the Department of Justice in court, if that's where you are. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. And let's just get right back into this. As we came up on that commercial break, I was talking about the income tax has to end. It can no longer be enforced as a direct tax on everything you do in the 50 states. There is no impost, duty, or excise basis for the taxation of any of the sources that the American people have been taxed on under Section 61, gross income. None of those sources are subject to indirect taxation by impost, duty, and excise. The government has only been able to allege that those sources were the basis for your taxation because it was a direct tax on all sources. So everything in gross income can be taxed directly. And that was a fraud. There is no direct tax, and Section 61 never taxed domestic sources. It was originally enacted in 1918 as part of a 75-year-long Canadian tax treaty. Section 61 never did anything but tax people living and working in Canada between 1918 and 1993. It was never domestic legislation that taxed all accessions to wealth. That's been the fraud, the socialist global fraud perpetrated on the people of America since 1955 and the Glenshaw Glass Supreme Court decision, where the Supreme Court said Section 61 is Congress taxing all accessions to wealth. Not taxing Canadian earned income, but all accessions to wealth. It's a direct tax. It was inferred. And that was the beginning of the socialist communist takeover of our tax and currency systems. So, what are the alternatives if the income tax ends? Well, as I said, they've discussed having a flat tax. We'll get rid of the brackets and just have a flat tax and tax everything you earn at a flat rate, 10, 15, 20%, whatever. Everyone will pay the same rate. And of course, that's not a viable alternative or replacement to the current system because it's exactly the same system. The unconstitutional direct taxation of all labor of the American people, of the right of the American people to earn, both from their own private property, sale and acquisition, and from their labor. It's a direct tax. It doesn't matter that everybody pays the same rate. It's unconstitutionally direct, without basis in impost, duty, or excise subjectivity, which only reach certain activities and transactions, events, and in places subject to indirect federal taxation by impost, duty, and excise. Foreign import, export, corporate license ATF commodities. That's it. If you don't earn money from one of those taxable activities, you don't owe any income tax and you've never paid any. And that's why none of the money taken from your paycheck ends up in the Treasury and a credit for tax. It ends up going to the Federal Reserve Bank. It's a peonage debt service system of involuntary servitude of the Congress's $37 trillion owed to the bank. None of the money funds the operation of the government. It goes around the Treasury. That's why there's no record of any tax paid until you file, even though the law requires that there be a record of tax paid the minute your employer sends in the quarterly escrowed funds. And of course, none of the money you send in on April 15th goes in the Treasury. It goes to the Federal Reserve Bank. Don't believe me? Look who cashed the check. Look in the back of the check. See if it says deposit to the U.S. Treasury, which would be tax. Or see if it says pay to any FRB, Federal Reserve Bank. Why is a private corporation, the Federal Reserve Bank, cashing your so-called tax check? Because it's a fraud. So a flat tax is unconstitutionally direct taxation without basis in impost, duty, and excise. It has the exact same constitutionality problem as the current system of graduated taxation. You can't have a flat tax without amending the Constitution, which isn't going to happen. How about a national sales tax. That's been a proposal, as we could have a system like the Europeans, a VAT, a value-added tax, where every level is taxed by the government on the additional value that level, wholesale, retail, distributor, whatever level it's at, whatever value is added, we'll tax that. Okay, but you can't have a federal sales tax. It's not constitutional. The Interstate Commerce Clause has long been recognized as a bar to the taxation by the federal government of retail sales activity in the 50 states. The Interstate Commerce Clause allows the federal government to tax the first sale at the wholesale level after interstate transport. There is no taxation of retail sales allowed under the Constitution by the federal government, because that is the exclusive territorial and legislative prerogative of the state governments, which control all activity in retail sales within their own state that don't involve things like alcohol, tobacco, firearms, or petroleum fuels, which are federally taxable activities and transactions. But everything else is under the exclusive prerogative of the state. Sales taxes can only be imposed by the state governments. And a VAT tax is, of course, a form of the sales tax, which is being imposed at every level of handling of the commodities, not just at the final retail sale point. When it goes from the wholesaler to the distributor, it's taxed. When it goes from the distributor to the store, it's taxed. When it goes from the store to the consumer, it's taxed again. A VAT tax taxes every level of transaction that occurs. And of course, again, these are just sales taxes on the different levels of commerce. And you can't have a sales tax. A VAT tax is just as unconstitutional as a sales tax, because it is a form of a sales tax that invades the exclusive prerogative, exclusive jurisdiction, both territorial and legislative, of the state governments. So the federal government is barred by the Constitution from having a flat tax. It's barred by the Constitution from having a sales tax. It's barred by the Constitution for having a VAT tax. And the last proposal they're throwing around is something called the fair tax. And the fair tax is supposedly a 25% flat sales tax on every transaction that occurs in the country, to get rid of the income tax, the Social Security tax, and I think the Medicaid tax as well. So they want to have a 25% tax on every single transaction. And again, this is just a sales tax. And having a sales tax, federal sales tax of 25%, that would kill the economy in the first week. States have found that when their sales tax rises above 6.5–7%, proceeds from the tax revenue go down. Because after 7%, the business goes underground. It goes cash. It doesn't report. It hides. People will accept a sales tax up to 5–6%. You go over 7% and they start to do business to avoid the tax. So a sales tax of 25% would be a depression within 60 days. Be a literal depression within 60 to 90 days. So none of the alternatives they're talking about are acceptable under the Constitution. And that brings us to the last possibility, which is what I believe is the way to go. It's my idea. What you want to do is get rid of the income tax entirely, both personal and corporate, and replace it, and get rid of the IRS, which neither the income tax nor the IRS can survive the coming revelation that it's been a constitutional fraud for 60 years. You got to get rid of them. The constitutional fraud is going to kill you. You get rid of the IRS and you immediately reconstitute it as the CRS, the Corporate Revenue Service. And then you don't tax corporate profits after they artificially eliminate all the profits with artificial expenses and inflated expenses that get rid of the profits. You tax corporate revenues without regard to losses, expenses, or any deductions, of which there are none. You tax all corporate revenues at like 5%. Not 40% of profits, not 20% of profits, because they account away all the profits. You tax at 5% of all corporate earnings, every single corporation in the country, except supermarkets. They operate on a 1% margin. They don't have 5% to pay. A 5% tax would raise the price of food 5%. So you exempt only supermarkets from this revenue taxation. Everybody else, every company, every business, 5% every month. Send it in quarterly, 5% of everything you do. And then the CRS, the Corporate Revenue Service, can spend its time auditing the companies and comparing their public statements, soliciting stock purchases, their annual declarations with the declarations that they made on their corporate submissions quarterly and at the end of the year. And they need like a 5-line return at the end of the year. Amount earned, amount paid, balance owed, and amount included, and amount still remaining after payment. 5% of everything. Every company, every month. And now you have a monthly budget that the federal government has to learn to live within. And that means you got to amend and modify your welfare programs. You have to start means testing welfare and Medicare recipients and Social Security recipients so that the welfare program is used as it was intended, to help those who need the help, and not as an entitlement to buy the votes of the insecure elderly who don't need the Social Security payment because they're independently wealthy. But hey, if the government's passing out money, they'll keep their money and live off of yours. And that, of course, means there isn't any money left for the poor who actually need it to survive. There's insufficient funds for them to live the month because they paid $3,000 out to people that didn't need it. And the person that do need it gets $750. The whole system is reversed. It's no longer a program for the poor. It's a program for the government to bribe the insecure elderly and buy votes from the elderly and the socialist youth who've been mal-educated in the public schools, which, by the way, is the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto. Make sure the young are too stupid to understand what's happening. Sell them on slogans and dreams, and tell them to ignore the reality they see them confronting in the face trying to get a job with an art history degree. Good luck. Or gender studies. Good luck. So, the only viable alternative, and we must replace the income taxes. As I said, it doesn't work. It doesn't fund the government. It puts the government in a position to rule rather than to represent. It divides the American people and keeps them fighting amongst themselves in a system of class warfare. It only results in the government assuming more power. If it swings to the left, they want more power. If it swings to the right, they want more power. Government never writes law for the whole of the American people. The politicians have to pick a class to supposedly represent, and then they can only write law for that class. And if they try to compromise and write law for the other class, they get voted out of office because they're not extreme enough committed to the agenda of the party they belong to. So, It's the taxation of corporate revenue, not income, that we need to move to, and that's the solution. I have all of this written up at taxfreedom.com. I think I hear the end music coming up. We'll be back next week. Good to go. Oh, that's right. We got to stop recording.